In the summer of 1402, an army from England descended through the valley of the Rio Lug, with the absolute certainty that the campaign would be brief. Sir Edmund Mortimer marched at the head of his troops like one leading a hunt, not a battle, convinced that the rebel Welsh were little more than rowdy peasants who would stop before the first glint of English armour. The terrain was gentle, the June sun warmed the fields, and the power of Inglaterra marched with its banners. Nothing foreshadowed what awaited on the green slope that the Welsh called Bryn Glas, the Collina Azul. But on that hill, something awaited them that no English officer had included in his calculations. A man who understood war not as a clash of armies, but as the transformation of the landscape into a deadly weapon. Up at the summit, the Welsh archers remained in absolute silence. In the hidden valley to one side, hundreds of warriors waited without moving, holding their breath. Mortimer ordered the advance, and then the sky closed. Arrows fell like black rain from the heights. The men on the flanks screamed when a wave of warriors emerged from where no one should have been. And then came what no one had imagined possible. The Welsh archers, serving within the army of Inglaterra itself, turned their bows. They fired against their own rankmates, cries of betrayal mixed with the cracking of shields. The slope became a river of chaos and blood. When the battle ended, one of the most powerful men in Inglaterra lay in chains on Welsh soil. The news reached Roma before the week was out. For the first time in more than 100 years, Gauls had made England tremble, and the name of the man behind it all would cross the centuries wrapped in a mixture of history and legend that very few warriors ever achieve. To understand how that Welsh army reached that hill that June morning, one must go back more than a century. In 1283, Rey Eduardo I of Inglaterra completed the conquest of Gales and forever extinguished the lineage of the native Welsh princes. It was not a gentle conquest. Eduardo the Fair built a ring of colossal fortresses designed to crush any attempt at resistance. Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, Flint. Castles of grey stone raised over the Welsh hills and ports like clenched fists. They were not simple military defences. They were declarations of permanent dominion, messages of granite that said silently and in English that the land no longer belonged to those who had always inhabited it. Under the English laws that followed the conquest, the Welsh became second-class citizens in their own land. They could not hold office in the church. They could not access government positions. They paid higher taxes than their English neighbours. They were prohibited from acquiring certain properties in cities considered English within Giles. The Lords Normandos and Ingleses built their own walled communities in territory of Giles, colonies of one nation within another nation, where the conquerors lived with their privileges, well guarded behind walls that separated them from the people they ruled. The Welsh lived on the margins of a prosperity that did not belong to them, farming lands for which they paid rent to lords who did not speak their language, praying in churches where sermons never sounded in Welsh, and burying their dead under the shadow of castles built to remind them every dawn that they had been conquered. Resentment accumulated for generations, slow and deep, like water carving through rock. At the end of the 14th century, that resentment was still simmering when English politics entered into convulsion. Rey Ricardo II, whom many Welsh respected and had served loyally for years, was overthrown in 1399 by his cousin Enrique de Bolingbroke, who proclaimed himself Enrique IV. The act was, technically, a usurpation. For the Welsh who had given genuine loyalty to Ricardo II, the question was inevitable. Should they obey a king who had taken the throne by force, betraying the very rules he supposedly protected? Enrique IV knew his legitimacy was fragile. He had enemies in the north of Inglaterra. Tensions with Francia threatened to escalate. Escocia watched. It was the most unstable moment for the English crown in decades. And in the hills of the north of Gales, a man watched it all with very attentive eyes. His full name was Owain ap Gruffudd, Seigneur of Glyndifrdwy and of Sycarth. History would know him as Owain Glyndwr, which in Welsh evokes the valley of the water of the Rio Dee. He was not a resourceless guerrilla, nor a desperate peasant with nothing to lose. He was precisely the opposite, a man who had enjoyed everything the Anglo-Gallese system could offer someone of his status, and who, upon seeing how that same system destroyed him without mercy, chose to tear it down. Owain was heir to two of the four great princely houses of Gales, a direct descendant of the princes of Powys and Deheubarth. His lineage went back to the Welsh rulers who had preceded the English conquest, and that granted him something money cannot buy: symbolic legitimacy in the eyes of his people. His great-grandfather had been one of the few Welsh nobles of royal blood who survived the crushing of the rebellion of 1282. The weight of that history fell on his shoulders with a force he himself had chosen to ignore for decades. Owain had received the best education possible for a man of his time and status. He studied law in Londres. He learned to move with ease in the circles of English power. He served as a soldier in royal campaigns, alongside Enrique de Bolingbroke himself before he became king. He knew firsthand how the world worked that ultimately kept his people subjugated. He spoke English and Français in addition to Welsh. He understood diplomacy. He knew how to distinguish between what the laws said and what the powerful did. Until the year 1400, Owain Glyndwr was a middle-aged man who managed his estates effectively, raised his large family, and seemed destined for a quiet life on the respectable margins of the Welsh nobility. He had a wife, children, lands, a recognized name, everything a man needs to not want to risk it all. Everything changed due to the ambition of a neighbor. Reginald Grey, Baron of Ruthin, was one of those English lords who ruled within Gales as if the land and those living on it were part of the same inventory of his estate. Grey seized lands belonging to Owain, lands that had been in his family for generations. Owain appealed to the English Parliament in search of justice, following exactly the procedures that were supposed to protect the rights of all the king's subjects. The Parliament ignored him. According to some chronicles, one member responded to the Welsh petition with a disdain that perfectly summarized the attitude of the English ruling class. What do we care about that barefoot Gallese? Later, Grey manipulated a royal summons so that Owain could not respond to Enrique IV's call for a campaign in Escotia, making the king believe that Owain was deliberately defying him. The label of traitor fell upon the Seigneur Gallese without him being able to defend himself. When the institutions that should have protected him not only ignored him, but became active instruments of his destruction, Owain Glyndwr made a decision that would transform the history of two nations. On September 16, 1400, at his estate in Glyndifrdwy, among the hills of the northeast of Gales, Owain gathered his closest allies. Present were his eldest son Gruffudd, his brothers-in-law, the Decano of St. Asaph, and around 270 men representing the families and clans of the region. Before them, with words that bards would repeat for centuries, he issued his proclamation. He declared himself Principe de Gales, not as a theatrical gesture, not as a minor provocation destined to be crushed in weeks, as a full-fledged political declaration that directly challenged the authority of the English crown. The next day, his men descended on the city of Ruthin, the fortress of his enemy Grey, and set it on fire. In the days that followed, Denbigh, Rhuddlan, Flint, Hawarden, Holt, Oswestry and Welshpool fell. English cities on Welsh land, symbols of foreign dominion, burned under the fire of an army that grew by the hour. The news spread with a speed no one had anticipated. In Oxford and Cambridge, Welsh students abandoned their books and began the long journey back home. Welsh labourers working in the English counties of Shropshire and Herefordshire left their tools on the ground and joined the movement. Veteran archers who had served under the English flag in Francia and Escotia arrived from the east. bringing with them the experience of dozens of campaigns. Bards wandered from town to town, sowing the verses of rebellion. In a few weeks, what had begun as a complaint by a Welsh lord against an abusive neighbour had become the cry of an entire people who had been waiting more than a century for someone to say out loud what everyone felt. Enrique IV marched to the north of Gales with his army, but found only empty mountains and abandoned villages. The Welsh had learned since the conquest of Eduardo the Fern that frontal combat against English power was suicidal. Owain applied a war of movement with the mastery of someone who understands that the terrain is his most reliable weapon. His men attacked, vanished into the forests and mountain mists, and reappeared miles away. Enrique IV's troops burned villages and executed suspects, but they found very few Welsh to face in open field. The king returned to Londres without having crushed anything. On April 1st, 1401, Good Friday, the rebellion struck a bold blow that resonated throughout Inglaterra. Rhys and Gwilym ap Tudur, distant cousins of Owain, captured the castle of Conwy through a brilliant deception. The Tudor, whose blood would run almost a century later through the veins of the first Enrique Tudor, King of Inglaterra, took one of the most symbolic fortresses of Eduardo I's Iron Ring, disguised as construction workers. That same year, Owain defeated English and Flemish forces at the Battle of Mynyd Hydgyn in the hills of Pumluman in central Gales. Victories multiplied recruits. The fire spread from north to south. At the beginning of 1402, Owain's men ambushed and captured Lord Grey himself, the Baron who had triggered everything with his greed. They held him prisoner until his family paid a colossal ransom. It was a perfect revenge. The man who had stripped him of everything now paid with the riches accumulated on those same stolen lands, while the ransom funds financed the war for Welsh freedom. And then came the summer of 1402, and with it, the morning that stopped time. On June 22nd, 1402, the Welsh general Rhys Gethin, the most feared and capable of Owain's commanders, had deployed his forces on the terrain with a precision that revealed months of meticulous planning. The Welsh army was significantly smaller than the approaching English force, but Rhys Gethin knew that the difference between numbers and position can change the outcome of any battle. Sir Edmund Mortimer advanced from the east through the valley of the Lugg with the confidence of a man going to solve a minor problem. He was a powerful lord with vast possessions in Gales and the border Marcus, a nephew of a man whose lineage actually had a better right to the English throne than Enrique IV himself. He was, like so many English before him, profoundly underestimating his enemy. Rhys Gethin divided his army into two parts. A small fraction of archers was placed on the visible crest of the hill of Bryn Glas. The rest of the warriors, the main force, hid in the wooded valley that ran parallel to the right flank of the English route, invisible under the thicket of trees. The trap was set. It only remained for the English army to walk into it. The English advanced through the valley and began to climb the steep slope toward the Welsh archers they could clearly see from below. It was exactly the image they wanted to see, the enemy exposed within reach of their own arrows. Mortimer ordered the advance. His archers began to fire upward, but the English arrows lost strength and precision, overcoming gravity, while the Welsh ones came down with all the power of height in their favor. Men began to fall in the first minutes. While the English infantry climbed the slope under the rain of arrows, the Welsh warriors, hidden in the wooded valley, began to move silently through the trees. They emerged from the thicket without making a sound, bypassed Mortimer's right flank, and charged his rear with the ferocity of those who have waited for the perfect moment with the patience of hunters. The English, who were already fighting uphill against the front, suddenly found themselves attacked from the sides and from behind as well. The formation buckled, order broke, and then came the moment no one would forget. The Welsh archers serving within Mortimer's own army, Welshmen recruited under the English flag, turned their bows. It is not known for certain if their betrayal had been agreed upon weeks before with Owain, or if, in the heat of battle, seeing the tide turn, they simply chose the side of their own blood. What is certain is that their arrows began to fly in a new direction against the English soldiers marching beside them. Cries of betrayal rose over the noise of combat. Confusion transformed into panic. The English army, attacked from the front, from the flanks, from the rear, and from within its own ranks, fell apart in a matter of minutes with a completeness that left the survivors unable to comprehend what had happened. Edmund Mortimer was captured alive on the battlefield. Enrique V made no effort to pay his ransom, perhaps because the Mortimer family had hereditary rights to the English throne that the usurper king preferred to keep weakened and in captivity. Mortimer, abandoned by his own king, made the most dramatic decision possible. He renounced his loyalty to the English crown, recognized his nephew's claim to the throne of Inglaterra, and married Catherine, the daughter of Owain Glyndwr. The captor became an ally. The enemy of yesterday, the son-in-law of today. The news of Bryn Glas reached Roma before the end of the week. Throughout Inglaterra, garrisons reinforced their positions. The lords of the Marcus Galesus sent urgent messages to Londres asking for reinforcements. The rebellion was no longer a regional nuisance that could be resolved with a punitive expedition. It was a threat that destabilized English politics at its foundations. The years that followed Bryn Glas were the golden years of Owain Glyndwr. Castle after castle fell into Welsh hands. In 1403, Owain forged an alliance with Henry Percy, the English noble known throughout Europa as Hotspur, whose family controlled the north of Inglaterra and who had his own reasons for challenging Enrique IV. If the coalition prospered, the English throne itself could totter. But Hotspur died at the Battle of Shrewsbury on July 21, 1403, before the Welsh forces and English allies could meet. It was the first major blow against the alliance that could have divided Inglaterra into pieces. Owain did not stop. In 1404, his forces captured the castles of Harlech and Aberystwyth, two of the most powerful fortresses of the iron ring Edward the had built to dominate Gales forever. Harlech became the seat of his court, the political and symbolic heart of his emerging principality. That same year, he summoned a parliament in Machynlleth, the city he considered the spiritual capital of his Free Gaels. Before him sat envoys from Escocia, Francia, España, and Britannia. In that hall, surrounded by the flags of nations that recognized him as an equal, Owain Glyndwr was formally crowned Príncipe de Gales. It was the first authentic Welsh parliament in more than a century, the first under a flag that was not that of Inglaterra. From the court of Harlech, Owain ruled as he had dreamed. He proclaimed laws based on the ancient Welsh code of Hywelda, which his people venerated as an expression of justice profoundly their own. He conceived two universities for Gauls, one in the north and one in the south. He negotiated with the papacy for the independence of the Iglesia Galesa from the tutelage of Canterbury. In 1405, he signed the Indenture Tripartito with Edmund Mortimer and the Conde of Northumberland, an agreement that planned to divide the kingdom of Inglaterra into three parts: Gales for Owain, the north for the Percy, the south for Mortimer. On paper, at that moment, the kingdom of Enrique IV was about to fracture into three pieces, and a French army of nearly 3,000 men landed in Gales in support of the alliance. But paper and the battlefield are different territories. At Woodbury Hill near Worcester, the Franco-Welsh army met Enrique IV's forces face to face. The two armies held their positions for days, watching each other, and then, for reasons historians still debate, neither attacked. Both forces withdrew. That was Owain's last great opportunity to cross the border and take the war to the heart of Inglaterra. He would not return. The tide began to turn. Príncipe Enrique, heir to the English crown and future Enrique V, took direct command of the campaigns in Gales with a methodical determination his father had never been able to sustain. The English did not seek battles in open field where the Welsh were masters. They sought castles, ports, supply routes. In 1406, the Welsh suffered defeats at Grosmont and Usk. English forces began to systematically reconquer Anglesey and the south of Gales. The coastal blockade cut off the arrival of reinforcements and supplies from Francia. Welsh crops failed under years of continuous war and looting. The people began to exhaust themselves under the weight of a struggle that had already consumed half a generation. In 1408, the castle of Aberystwyth fell. In February 1409, Harlech surrendered. With Harlech, the court, the symbol, the heart of the principality that had existed for a fleeting and brilliant moment, was lost. Owain's wife, Margarita, and several of his daughters were captured in the fall of the fortress and taken to Londres as prisoners, where they would die without knowing freedom. The war continued, but it was no longer the same war. It was a series of ambushes, of local resistances, of a man who refused to bend, even as everything he had built crumbled stone by stone around him. In the year 1411, the young Enrique V, already King of Inglaterra, offered Owain Glyndwr a full pardon, the possibility of returning to the life of a Welsh lord, of spending the rest of his days in peace. Owain rejected it in silence. In 1412, he was seen for the last time in action, leading an ambush against royal troops in the northwest of Gales. After that date, he simply disappeared. He was not captured. He was not betrayed by any follower. He was not executed on any scaffold. He never signed any surrender. He simply vanished into the mountains that had always been his deepest homeland, his shield and his home. His son Maredudd accepted the royal pardon in 1421, formally closing the rebellion. But his father had closed nothing. He had simply ceased to be visible. Some chroniclers of the time claimed that Owain died around 1415 at the home of one of his married daughters in Herefordshire. But no English witness saw him die. No grave was publicly claimed. No body was presented as a trophy before the king. And in the void of that absence grew something that no army can conquer: the legend. The Welsh poets called him Y Mab Darogan, the Hijo de la Profecia. They said he had not died, that he slept somewhere among the ancient mountains, waiting for the moment when Gales needed him again. It was the same legend that English tradition attributed to Rey Arturo, that king without a grave who would one day return to save his people. That the Welsh applied that same archetype to Owain Glyndwr said more than any chronicle. This man did not belong only to his time, he belonged to all times to come. William Shakespeare immortalized him in his play Enrique IV, Primera Parte, presenting him as a figure of almost supernatural grandeur, a leader who claimed that the very earth had trembled at the moment of his birth. That the greatest playwright of the English language chose to confer such poetic dignity upon an enemy of Inglaterra speaks to the inescapable weight that man had achieved in the memory of two nations that could never ignore him. Owain Glyndwr was the last native Welshman to hold the title of Príncipe de Gales. After him, the title passed to the English crown forever. By the Estatuto de Gales of 1536, Gales was formally integrated into the Kingdom of Inglaterra. The rebellion did not achieve the independence it dreamed of, but for 15 years, a man without the resources of a kingdom, without the navy of a maritime power, and without the treasury of an empire, held the most powerful nation in the British Isles in check. He captured its castles, he established his parliament, he sealed alliances with kings and with the papacy. He made his name ring in the court of Francia, in the records of Roma, in the councils of Escocia and España. And when the moment came when he could surrender with honor, he chose not to. He left. Today, his name is engraved in schools and on streets throughout Gales. His banner, The four lions rampant he had inherited from the princes of Powys and Deheubarth remains the symbol of the movement for Welsh identity. Every September 16th, the people of Gales remember the day a middle-aged lord gathered 270 men on his ancestral lands and challenged the most formidable power of his world. Not because it was the most prudent or reasoned moment, but because it was the only moment possible, the only moment the pride of a subjugated people could tolerate. Fidel Castro and Ernesto Guevara cited him as the first guerrilla of modern history. 20th century historians recovered him from the shadow where the victors had confined him for centuries. The Welsh people never forgot him at all. Somewhere among the ancient mountains of the country he loved and never surrendered, among the mist that descends through the northern valleys on autumn dawns, the echo of that cry continues to resonate. And there are those who say, in the quietest valleys of Gales, that when the wind blows from the mist-covered peaks and the world seems too burdened with injustice, it is still possible to hear the name that made a kingdom tremble. Owain Glyndwr, the last Welshman who made Inglaterra tremble, and the first who proved to the world that small peoples, if they have a man to wake them, can shake the foundations of empires.